agree with Craig Hodges?
Not everything. I certainly respect his position because I respect the hell out of him. You can't be a black man in America and not respect Craig Hodges. There's just no way. He was a career 40% shooter from three-point range. He was he won back-to-back, actually 3 consecutive three-point shooting contests. We know that, or at least back-to-back, if I remember correctly. I think it was 90, 91, 92. And not only that, he was a conscientious observer, and he was an activist by every stretch of the imagination. He was recruited by the late, great Tex Winter, Phil Jackson's assistant coach, to come to Cal State, Long Beach State, if I remember correctly. He loved Tex Winter. Obviously, I got to give props on this particular day to Phil Jackson. We all know as great of a coach as I think he is, I lament his state of affairs with the New York Knicks. But he did hire Craig Hodges when Craig Hodges was broke. And obviously struggling. And Craig Hodges is of the mindset that he was blackballed by the NBA. I think that involves a concerted effort. I don't think it was that sophisticated. I just think it was one of those situations because he was raised by an activist. His father was a former mayor of the township. His mother, obviously, both of his parents were politically active. His grandparents were politically active as well, from what I read. And so this is the kind of upbringing that he had. He's incredibly conscientious, well-read, very, very knowledgeable, etc. And those things may have rubbed people the wrong way because he wore his blackness on his sleeve unapologetically when he rolled up at the White House with a dashiki on, even though former Commissioner David Stern swears he complimented Craig Hodges about that. The bottom line is people looked at him and considering the Islamophobia that existed, even though he himself never identified himself as a Muslim, just as a person that loved all religions and loved to study all religions. There was no question that from an optics perspective, he was perceived as a supporter of Islam. Islamophobia obviously did exist back then. It still exists today, I might add. There is no denying that. And as a result, considering him, and when you think about Mahmoud Abdul Rauf and what he had to go through because he didn't want to stand for the national anthem, etc., you can understand why the word blackball comes to mind about Craig Hodges. But in the end, specifically as it pertains to this docuseries, I think one of the important things to recognize is the fact that, again, a lot of his issues, even though we're articulating or playing excerpts of his personal beef with Jordan in terms of calling out Scottie Pippen for being selfish, calling out Horace Grant for talking to Sam Smith about the Jordan rules, even though Horace Grant denied that. He felt that that was out of pocket, along with several other things. Where I do disagree with Craig Hodges is that I think he gives the impression at times, at least throughout recent history, not necessarily with those excerpts that we played, where Jordan could have done more for him. And I think that at that particular time when the NBA was still trying to grow, where it was trying to ride Jordan's coattails into a new era and what have you, that's asking an awful lot. When you roll up on Michael Jordan and Magic Johnson on the basketball court before the 1991 Game 1 NBA Finals and say to them, boycott. Come on now. Magic Johnson, according to reports, said that was a bit extreme. As black people, we understand that racism, racial inequality, prejudice, and all of that stuff exists. We fight it every day. We fought it every day of our lives. But for every Jim Brown, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, Kurt Flood, Muhammad Ali, and others who have a mindset and a thought process of how to go about fighting things, there were others who disagreed. We revere and deify Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X, as far as I'm concerned, pretty equally. But they clearly had a different approach, at least for the vast majority of their careers doing what they were doing as civil rights activists fighting on behalf of black people and inequality. There are several ways to skin a cat, and I think Craig Hodges came across at times as his way is the way. And if you don't agree with him, particularly if you're somebody of Jordan's ilk, you had a problem with him. And that's where I somewhat jump off that bandwagon in that regard. There are things that I wish Jordan did earlier on in his career, things that he had did differently or what have you. But I don't think it's a reason to castigate or vilify him to the degree that some of his former teammates, contemporaries, et cetera, would choose to do, considering what he's done for them, what he's done for the game.
Two things are true about Craig Hodges. One, he could shoot the lights out, and two, he's going to speak his mind. Good for him. Doesn't mean you have to agree with everything he says, obviously. I didn't understand. I'd like some clarification from Craig Hodges. What I didn't understand is he went at Jordan in one of his comments something along the lines of, Jordan, there's a pandemic and people are lining up to get as though Jordan's putting out a product that people have to go to like a movie theater to see or to a record store to buy like in the old days, and therefore it's not a good idea to put this out now. In fact, I'd like clarification from him. I'm very fuzzy on what that means because, in fact, it seems to me like the release date of this doc was pushed up because everyone's is sheltering in place at home, and there's no new content, no new entertainment content, sports content. And here you have this documentary, and I think ESPN made the right choice here. Instead of waiting months to see it, let's push up the date. Let's show it to people now. It's not like people have to go to some central location to watch it. People are watching at home. I think that's great. So I didn't understand that point. Maybe he can clarify. But otherwise, this idea that you can have kind of politically or socially conscious views and not think that Jordan did enough, that's uncontroversial. That's fine. Jordan may feel differently, or others may feel differently. Or a reasonable argument would even be, look, Jordan's behavior in this instance, as it relates to this issue, was suboptimal. It's okay, and people live and learn. But was Craig Hodges out of line? Well, he obviously thinks Jordan was out of line. One along the lines of what I just said, where like clarification, not sure what he means. And then he also mentioned about not supporting Horace Grant or Scottie Pippen or kind of diming out his teammates because he mentioned that there was drug use going on in a room in the documentary.